Secretary sent me a message that you wasn't sure if the interview was still going to take place.
Yeah, well, you're just catching me here in the morning, and you get what you see.
Yeah, good. So it's morning. It's morning in the United States right now, right? All
Absolutely.
right. So
And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Timon,
Timon. Nice to
Timon.
meet you,
Yes,
Timon.
it's a typical Dutch name,
Okay.
Timon.
Yep. Yep.
So let me start by explaining the goal of my interview. I write about education, and I'm trying to bridge gaps between science and classroom practice. And I'm hoping to find tools to improve education. And I think psychology offers many great tools. So that's why I'm here, and that's why we're talking. Um, I'm trying to find, best practices for education.
Right.
Um, and I think your theory provides education with best practices and tools. So your theory is very commonly used in education, especially the words autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Everybody in education in Holland talks about these words. So my
I
first.
wish I wish that were true in the U.S.
All right. Well, we'll get to
It
that
is more
later.
global phenomenon.
We will get to that later. So, um, first of all, and that's maybe a difficult question. What if you had to explain your theory to one of my first graders, a 12-year-old boy, or
Hmm.
a 13-year-old girl? What would you say to them about the self-determination theory? How would you explain it to a child?
Well, I would think I would just talk about the fact that there are some kinds of classrooms where children learn best, and we're really interested in what are the conditions in those classrooms? What's the climate like in those classrooms? The feelings in those classrooms, and we're trying to help teachers create those feelings that are associated with the best engagement and the highest quality learning.
All right. So you talk about feelings. How would you explain those aspects to um, uh, one of my students? Are those feelings autonomy? Are those is competence? Is it
Yeah, that
relatedness?
sense of, that sense of autonomy is just that sense of you have a reason for doing something. You're willing to do it rather than feeling pushed and forced into it. Every kid understands this one. They know the difference between doing something because they have value or interest, and versus doing it because somebody's making you do it.
All right.
So that's the autonomy piece, and the competence piece is doing something where you can feel like you could be successful, where you can actually what you're doing. You have some confidence to move ahead a little bit, as opposed to you don't really feel like you know what you're doing. You don't really have the skills to do the next thing. The relatedness is feeling like you matter, like people appreciate that you're there and care that you exist. those
Yeah.
things, those things matter.
I
So
com-
all of those things are things that are right in the sensibilities of 13-year-olds, the kids, or even younger. Really as early as kids get in school, they know the difference between this feeling of willingness versus being coerced into doing things. This
yeah.
feeling of connected versus not connected. So these are, even though the words are not the words people usually use for them, it's the common everyday experience of children, of adults.
Yeah. All right. So I read your book, which covers 40 years of research.
I'm
Um,
sorry for you. I hope it treated any insomnia that you have.
no, that was pretty complex. That's why I asked the first question: how would you explain um, this book to any 12-year-old? I think that's a difficult task. At least it was for me. I think a subject is clear once you're able to explain it to a 12-year-old or even younger. So what I'm really curious about is,
I just want to take one issue with you on this, by the way.
yeah,
So I hear this a lot from people who talk to psychologists. And I often imagine, would you go to a person in another scientific field like physics and say, well, if you can't explain your theory of relativity to 12-year-olds, then it must not be relevant or meaningful.
so So I'm not the first one who asks you to do
So I
that.
do hope that psychological theories become very complex, and in some ways, maybe more than the general public would follow.
Yeah,
Because otherwise, what is the science doing?
yeah, it's true. It's true. But
It's not
as
moving to some
as
complexities that have some nuance to them, and
of course,
would not be what's just obvious in the common sense mind. Then okay,
yeah.
then there's not much there.
Well, it's true. But the thing is, I'm trying to bridge those gaps between science and classroom practice. And when
Yeah, yes,
sometimes
absolutely.
it's really difficult to translate these scientific insights into practical tools for
Yeah.
classroom teachers. And
And
so,
so that's why, Timmy. I think you've seen even in the book that we do pretty practical interventions. The way I would do workshops with teachers is not to go into a lot of theory. We go pretty close, pretty quickly to practice. So there's a difference between what you might do to affect some of the variables that we're talking about in the scientific discourse, and then how you represent them in the you know
yeah.
in your experimental work.
Now, when we talk about best practices, I'm really curious about schools in your country. I think it's two countries, US and Australia, if I'm correct. Um,
Yeah, right. I am.
um, so currently, you're a professor in the United States and in Australia.
It's mostly Australia now.
It's
I'm
not.
there
Uh,
most of the time. That's my main appointment. I'm fading out of Rochester, so I'm finishing up with my students there.
I see. So what I'm really curious about is, I'm sure over the 40 years, many schools have implemented your theory somehow. Um, do you have any really good examples of schools who really have improved their education, their output in any way uh, um, by using your theory?
Well, so I guess there's a couple questions here. The way our theories had influence on schools is that people have adopted many of its principles, but they haven't done what I would call gold standard studies, like any RCTs, where we've seen, oh, these principles are implemented, and then we've seen on the other side, oh, here's a measured improvement as a result of that specific implementation. So I don't really have any great examples that document this. I have seen that over many years, the kind of philosophical and practical positions of SDT have been incorporated into the discourse of educators all around the world. And I see them putting them into practice. And there's been intervention tests, like John Marshall Reeve and others have done some specific interventions to show you can teach autonomy support skills. The teachers do improve in that has some irradiating effect on student motivation. So there are experimental demonstrations, but I don't have like a whole school example for you.
No, not like that school did an intervention with SDT, and somehow the cognitive output was higher.
Right.
The
Yeah, no, I
results.
don't have anything like that for you. In fact,
Oh,
every once in a while I'll hear that there's a school that's been built around SDT principles, and I've been excited to go see some, but I've actually never seen one. And I was just in Iceland. Somebody told me there that they have a new school that's now 3 years old, built around SDT principles, and I didn't get a chance to see it in the 10 days I was there, and I'm disappointed. So,
I
no, I
see.
don't have anything to report on this.
One of your most cited publications was published in 1985. Um, there was no YouTube back then. There was no iPhone. There was no social media back then.
That's correct.
Um, what has technology done for this theory? How did technology influence the evolution of SDT?
Well, I mean, I really got to have to take that in two directions. One is STT has had to move toward technology. So I don't know if you've seen a lot of our work is on virtual environments and video games, and more recently I'm working with Rafael Calvo, who's an engineer in Sydney, really on the motivations for people using technology and the impact it has on well-being as a function of how technology affects our autonomy, affects our relatedness, affects our
Yes.
efficacy in the world. I guess on the other side of it, technologies had some role in the dissemination of SDT because we've had We early on had a website that disseminated our work freely to as many people as we could. We've tried to make use of the tools of the trade, so to speak, to make sure people are aware of what's going on in the research community.
I see. So
Right.
we talked about practical tools, and when I visited selfdetermination.org, I saw many questionnaires. Are there maybe some easier ways for teachers, like an app or some kind that makes measuring relatedness or competence a lot easier than those questionnaires on the website? I mean, more modern tools, easily accessible for
Yeah,
students.
well, almost all the things that you've seen on the website, somebody has put them into accessible um, assessment strategies. We have a platform that does everything on your smartphone for all of those questionnaires. And in fact, we use genetic algorithms to reduce those questionnaires usually to one item per subscale because it estimates almost as well as those full things. There's really a difference between practical work in the world and then what goes into the psychological journals. And so to publish something in the journals, you need these measures that have multiple items for every construct that don't really help validity, but they help reliability and other fetishisms of researchers. So, there's a lot of accessible tools out there. But I guess if I were a teacher, I wouldn't be so focused on measurement. Part of the message of SET is focus on your process,
Yeah.
not on your outcomes. Don't
Well,
be trying to
thing,
push the numbers, but
the
focus
thing,
on the things that are going on in the classroom that really
yeah,
have to do with relatedness, autonomy, and competence. If measurement's going on, somebody else ought to be doing the measurement.
I know. But the thing is, I think this is a really important theory, and the Dutch government is focusing really on cognitive output. That's the only
Yeah,
thing we measure. We
yeah.
don't
Same in the
measure.
same in the U.S.
Yeah, we don't measure well-being at all. It doesn't really matter. If we can't measure it, um, it's not important to us in education. So that's why I'm asking about measurement tools. What if we can show the Dutch government, hey, here's a nice app. If we can actually measure competence, we can actually measure autonomy. Maybe it becomes more relevant for our government because somehow policymakers and ministers want to measure everything. That's why I'm
Well,
asking.
let me just say this. I have the belief, and I think it's been shown in a lot of places that if you can increase the right process variables in classrooms, you'll get better outcomes. And so the mistake of policymakers in the U.S. in particular, and also in some European countries, has been to try and motivate outcomes through what we call outcome-focused rewards or high-stakes testing. And the more you have high stakes around an outcome, the more you reinforce any route to that outcome. So you get people teaching to tests, doing kind of classroom practice that's the least engaging to students,
Yeah.
crowding out material that is interesting to students, what we call reallocation of content, so that you're, again, teaching to the test. So all that corruption of classroom practice goes on when you're focused on outcomes. And a lot of governments have done this. What we would advocate is if you focus on giving teachers the support for being autonomy, supportive, competence, supportive, and related supportive in the classroom, then that will produce those measurable outcome changes that
Yeah.
occur. But if you try the other way around, it actually has a backfiring effect. So what we've seen in the U.S. is high-stakes testing, because it's a really bad motivational strategy by trying to reinforce an outcome, has really led to a lot of collateral damage in our schools.
Yeah, the thing is, last month I talked to Professor John Hattie, which you
Yes.
might know, and he told me all those measurements are politics of distraction. That's his word for these things that don't really matter. He calls them politics of distraction, but still politicians and policymakers keep doing them. Why?
Right.
What's happening? Why are we so into measuring?
Well, I sadly think there's been an accountability, they call it an accountability movement that's been around really since the turn of the century in a very strong way. People do have this sense that you have to show evidence. And I think that's one of the reasons that, at least as a practitioner and theorist, I really cared about evidence. I think SDT's always tried to be very evidence-based because that's one of the ways in which you can convince people something's worthwhile. You really can demonstrate it in a replicable way. Luckily, most of the things that we do in SDT have been widely replicated.
Yeah.
I breathe a sigh of relief every time it's true. But it's really important that we come with the kind of evidence base that we have to say here, here's good practices and here's how they work.
You say you're relieved every time the outcome says it's true. So,
Yeah.
how about Africa? How about Asia? How are the day? How big is SDT in Africa, for example?
Well, I would say SDT is quite big in Asia. So there's been a lot of testing and implementation of SDT in many different places in Asia. Of course, I've worked in Singapore myself for some period of time, and in China, there's a lot of practitioners who are using SDT. In Korea, there's a big center for the study of SDT. Certainly, Australia, which is pretty multicultural, has a lot of Asian groups in it who are using SDT. So Asia is a place where it's become quite popular. I think it's been embraced by a lot of scholars and theorists there. Africa, there's only recently has there been, I'd say, any real dedicated work. There's some recent work both in Nigeria and in Ghana, in particular, applying SDT work to school children. So work in Nigeria has really just shown that all the principles, variables of SDT apply in Nigerian schools, that autonomy is predictive of the same outcomes in those schools as it is in typical European schools. I think the work in Ghana has been particularly interesting because it's really been about how in a traditional vertical culture, autonomy really matters. And what they were able to show there is that even in that cultural context, adults who are more able to take the frame of reference of their children, to listen, to care about their point of view, have adolescents who better internalize the adult values and do better in school as a result.
I see. So one of the words that are really hot in Holland are 21st century skills.
Yeah.
Skills. How? What's your opinion about 21st century skills? Because this is really becoming big in education. Everybody talks about 21st century skills. This morning I talked to the Director General of the Finnish Education
Yeah.
Ministry, and we talked also about 21st century skills. It's really important. What's your view about on 21st century skills?
Well, I certainly think that the world has changed a lot, and we talk about it in terms of the Copernican turn in the world, which is now, in the past, institutions kind of directed people on what to do, but now people have to access institutions for everything that they want. So it really means you got to be an information gatherer, not just and a selective receiver of information, because the amount of information people have in the world is just overwhelming. That requires some critical thinking, some discernment, some things that you really learn by truly learning. And this is one of the reasons why I think the high stakes testing movement, which kind of focuses around a body of knowledge as if knowledge is static, is really a losing game in education. We want to help instead learners become true learners, to be able to face information, assimilate it, be critical of it, make use of it. That to me is what 21st century skills are really about. And you get that only through active learning. You cannot get that through kind of passive acceptance or receptivity as the only educational strategy. So I think it's really important that people are talking about this. I applaud that, but then when we think about what kind of motivation, what kind of engagement do you have to have students have in order to develop those skills? Clearly, they have to be actively involved in generation and criticism of knowledge.
It must be as difficult to measure as creativity. How do you measure creativity? How do you measure? I mean, it's difficult to measure. It's difficult to implement. So one of my questions is, when you look at education in Australia and the United States, they're really two different kinds. I'm aware of that. What do you see? What do you?
Well, I think Australia faces many of the same problems that the U.S. does. Is first, you still do have a lot of high stakes built around certain fundamental tests, and you have schools scrambling to meet those criteria because they're quite public and people make choices based on those things. So there's very high stakes. It drives a lot of, I think, the same classroom practice concerns, the same accountability movements that we're both uh, a bit complaining about here. Have the same negative effects in both countries. You also see that in both countries there's disparity in education as a result of racial and economic segregation. Now, Australia is a quite different country. It has, a much better safety net in some ways, but it also has an Aboriginal population that's suffered generations of abuse in the past, and they're still in need of some different kinds of educational reform and inputs. So there are some parallel things that are going, that I see in the U.S. and also in Australia. One is this disparity issue, which is you do have groups that are not getting high quality education, and interventions to do something about that.
But the one major difference is the fact that in Australia you don't have an education inspection, and you do in America, and that's a whole different approach, and that's why
education what?
A government inspection, inspectors that it must be the correct word. Yeah.
But you do have. I mean, in both countries, you have legislation that says that there are certain credentialing features and certification features for schools, and that all those criteria have to be met. And so I guess I haven't noticed that as a big difference.
All right.
Between.
So, how is your cooperation with Edward Deci? Do I pronounce correctly? I don't know how to pronounce.
Yeah, it's Deci. Yeah. It's French, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. How after all those years, how's your cooperation? Because it's again the same two famous names that are always connected in many researches and books.
Well, we put up with each other.
That's all. Oh, that sounds great. Yeah.
I mean, I think we have a continued interest in the same topics. Part of a good thing about collaborating with somebody else is that there's kind of a check and balance in ideas. You have somebody to criticize, somebody to, be skeptical, so that ideas really have to be vetted and developed. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm minding time, so I was told you'll have about half an hour. Has education changed under the Trump administration? Have you seen effects in education?
Well, there hasn't really been time for much policy to be disseminated. The new Secretary of Education is named Betsy DeVos. Her thing has mostly been to deregulate education. So there's been a really good thing. I mean, I guess it's kind of weird for me to say a really good thing from the Trump administration, but one thing that has been passed recently is they dropped some of the requirements from the race to the top policy under Obama, which was maybe one of the worst educational policies in the history of the U.S.
Together with No Child Left Behind.
It was No Child Left Behind on steroids.
Oh, wow.
And so because what Obama had was he had a lot of money to put behind rewarding states for their performance on high-stakes standardized tests, and so and it bound states in order to get that money to do more of this test and press on these particular kinds of things. So the Obama administration was really terrible in this regard. So recently, a different law was passed, which gives states, it's called the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, or something like that. But it basically loosens the requirement that states would tie their evaluations of teachers to high-stakes standardized tests, for instance. Now, it's a deregulation, but it's actually an improvement over the Obama administration approach to this issue. I mean, the bad part of the Trump administration is that they're all about privatization of schools and pushing charter schools that are for-profit and at the same time non-profit. So they have an agenda that is, I think in the long run, is a dangerous agenda for American public schools. But the immediate thing of getting rid of the race to the top requirements has been a good thing.
All right. My two last questions. The first one, who inspires you today in education, politics, science? Uh, um, who should I interview next? Who is your big inspiration?
Oh, I don't know. There's a lot of inspirations I think out there. The one person I don't know if you know Matthew Ricard. That he's a monk and also a scholar. He wrote a book recently called Altruism that I like quite a bit. We met recently. I found him to be, just a good soul in every respect, and I appreciated that. And then I enjoyed his scholarship subsequently. So he's one person I'd suggest you interview. It'd be fun.
All right. Thanks. And the last question is, yeah, I'm always looking for practical tools. I have a book, I have a great theory, and I'm a teacher, and I want to use these insights tomorrow. Where do I start?
Well, I guess one thing in that book is just a simple table of the kinds of behaviors that are associated with autonomy support. Those are the things that we would focus on in teacher training. It's really the kind of practical things about listening to students, trying to take stock of what their concerns, what their barriers might be when you're assigning something. That idea that the other person is an agent and that you really want to respect that agency is really, it's more about a sensibility than it is even a set of like very concrete techniques. I think once you adopt the sensibility and the care for those things, the techniques will follow. They can be sharpened, but the first thing is that I'd want to help instill that sensibility in teachers to remember that the job of education is to nurture students.
I
It's to
see.
help
Yeah.
them emerge as learners, not to shove some things down their throats.
And of course, we can apply this theory on many levels. One of the levels I'm really interested in as well is the policy level. What if you have to give our Ministry of Education, our minister, an advice? I'm sure
Yeah.
you have talked on national level as well about this theory and how to apply this on a national level. What's your message to?
Well, so the main message is that the best educational systems in the world are the ones that are giving the most autonomy and professional support to their teachers. So if you look at Singapore, if you look at Finland, if you look at the places that are really, I think in most people's eyes, the best experiments, one of the things they've done is they've shown that they really value teachers. They give teachers relatively high salaries in the culture and good status, and then they back them up with a lot of training and developmental support. Both countries also have a real concern with process in the classroom, which is what teacher training is about, is creating the right teacher approach in the classroom and then expecting that the outcomes will follow from that. So I think, from a policy point of view, it would be support teachers to be professional, support them to do their job, give them the autonomy they need to be professional on their job, and that also means more also local autonomy for schools, because principals can be really creative forces in creating a good school, but they need to be able to make local decision making about all kinds of things that's often prevented in bureaucratic systems. So, autonomy all the way up. We want more autonomy in the learners, but to do that, we have to have more autonomy in the teachers, which means also there's to be more local school autonomy. So all the way up the chain would be
Autonomy is the key word. The,
it's
to
totally the key
the,
word.
the Director General of the Finnish Education told me the key word in Finnish education is trust. He
Mm-hmm.
said trust. We trust teachers. We don't have an inspection because we know they know what's best for education.
That's
Trust.
right. Exactly right. Right. I would go with that idea that it's really about trust, but it's also about professionalism. You got to support. You have to provide the scaffolding and the supports. I mean, trust is a good thing, but you also need confidence.
Yeah, but
So
that's
it's both
but
things.
he said I trust my teachers because they all have the highest level of education. They all have a university master and they know what they're doing and we don't have to inspect any of that. We trust them because we know they had sufficient education.
And at the same time, policymakers want some metrics for accountability, and given that they will want that, I would encourage people to be moving away from single metrics toward more what I would call dashboards, and so that you're looking at multiple metrics for any particular school. and you do everything you can to take high stakes away from any single metric because it always corrupts the system. So from a policy point of view, those things are really important.
So, um, thanks for your time. Um, I was just curious, what's next for you? Because there's this great book. Um, what's your next step?
Well, one of the things that you've said a few times is that that book is it's a technical book. It's not very accessible. Most of the research in SDT is not that accessible. So, I wanted to get this one done because that's really a program and framework for the science of self-determination theory. But we need some more accessible material. So, my hope is that I can clear out some time to be writing, particularly a book for parents.
That would be nice. I look
That's
forward to it. So,
that would
thank
be.
you. Thanks a great deal for your time. Um, and well, I hope um, we will use these insights in Dutch education, and I'm sure it will improve Dutch education as a whole. Especially your last words about autonomy. I think that's where we should head, where we are heading, and we must go.
Well, thanks very much. And if there's any clarifications, just drop me an email, and
I will.
I'll
Okay.
all right.
Thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Thanks. Yep.
Cheers.
Bye bye.